Poirot and the Case of the Engraved Cufflinks. Chapter 1. An Unlikely Encounter. The drizzle of a London autumn had begun, an indifferent mist rising from the pavements, enveloping the city in its murky embrace. It was the sort of evening that turned streets into shadows and lamplights into ghosts of golden glow. Within the dim-lit confines of a quiet coffee house tucked away on Great Russell Street, Hercule Poirot sat at a table by the window, the dark outside reflected on the glass as he sipped his espresso. There was an air of calmness about the Belgian detective, one who had long since retired from the intensity of police work, preferring the quiet of a post office life where the only puzzles to solve were those of crosswords and the occasional curious neighbour. But tonight, something stirred within him. The bell above the door jingled softly as a figure stepped into the room, its silhouette cutting through the haze of steam and chatter. Poirot did not immediately look up. He had perfected the art of observing without appearing to do so. The figure was a woman, young, perhaps in her late 20s, dressed in a coat too thin for the weather, with a scarf hastily wrapped around her neck. Her hair was dark, dishevelled, as though she had rushed out in a state of anxiety. She hesitated for a moment, her eyes scanning the room, before they fell upon Poirot. With a swift, almost imperceptible movement, she made her way toward him. As she drew near, Poirot's sharp eyes took in the faint tremor of her hands, the nervous flicking of her glance to the door behind her. It was as though she were both seeking and avoiding something, or perhaps someone.
"Ah, mademoiselle," Poirot greeted her smoothly, his voice rich with the calmness of a man used to solving the most complex of puzzles. "You have found me, it seems. Please do sit. What brings you to me on such a dreary night?" The woman's eyes darted about once more, her lips pressed together tightly as she took a seat opposite him. She lowered her voice to a whisper, almost as though afraid the walls themselves might overhear her.
I am in danger," she said, her words almost lost in the murmur of the coffee house. Her hands trembled as she clutched her purse. Poirot raised an eyebrow, his interest piqued. It was rare for someone to speak so openly about their peril, especially in a public place such as this. "In danger?" Poirot repeated, his voice steady, but the little grey cells of his mind already beginning to work. "You are not one to speak in riddles, I trust." Jenny, he had not yet learned her name, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She seemed to consider her words carefully, as though weighing the consequences of each syllable. "It's connected to the murders at the Monarch Hotel," she continued. "The ones on the news. 3 people, all dead, but She hesitated, looking away for a moment, before meeting Poirot's gaze with a new intensity. Poirot's hand froze midway to his cup. The Monarch Hotel murders. He had heard whispers of the tragic events, the bodies of Harriet Sipple, Ida Grensbury and Richard Negus discovered in separate rooms, all bearing the same chilling clue, a monogrammed cufflink in each of their mouths with the letters P.I.J. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured softly, his voice betraying a trace of unease. It was not the murders themselves that intrigued him. He had seen his share of tragic deaths, but the peculiar detail that linked them. The cufflinks with the initials, the precision with which the victims had been arranged, it all seemed too deliberate, too calculated. He leaned forward, his hands folded neatly on the table. "You are afraid," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "And I see that you know more than you are willing to tell me. But if you wish my assistance, you must speak plainly, mademoiselle." Jenny's eyes darted about the room once more, and she lowered her voice to a near whisper, her words trembling. "The killer is after me next. I know it." Her hand flew to her throat as though to stifle the panic that threatened to spill out. I don't know why, but they have the same initials, the same as the cufflinks. P.I.J. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his fingers tapping lightly on the table, as his mind began to piece the puzzle together. This was no ordinary case. The killer was not acting at random. Whoever had orchestrated these murders had a reason for choosing these victims, for leaving the same signature behind. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said slowly, "you have a connection to these deaths, I think? Perhaps something that links you to the victims, to the initials P.I.J.? Jenny stiffened, her hand tightening around her purse. I don't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I worked at the hotel. I've seen the initials before, but I'm not sure how they're connected. I think they're trying to silence me. I don't know who else could be involved, but they're watching me. I know it." Poirot observed her carefully, his mind already assembling a theory. There were many possibilities, but one stood out. Could Jenny have been involved, perhaps unknowingly, in the events surrounding the murders? Had she seen something at the Monarch Hotel, something that made her a target? He pressed further, though his tone remained gentle. "You must be brave, mademoiselle, and help me understand. You spoke of P.I.J. Do you know what it signifies? What connection does it have to you or the victims?" Jenny's eyes clouded with confusion, but there was a flicker of recognition. She was holding something back, and Poirot could sense it. The puzzle pieces were slowly falling into place, though the picture remained incomplete. "I don't know," she said again, her voice more frantic now, "but it's all connected, the initials, the victims, and now in me." Poirot sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. He could tell that Jenny was not lying, but there was a deeper truth hidden in her words, a truth she herself did not fully understand. "Mademoiselle," he said, his voice calm and reassuring, "you are in no immediate danger, but we must find the truth behind these murders. You must tell me everything, no matter how small the detail may seem." Jenny took a deep breath, her fingers loosening around the purse. "I will, but I'm afraid—" Poirot smiled, a small but reassuring smile, as he placed his hand on hers. "You are right to be afraid, but fear will not help you now. Let us uncover the truth together, step by step." And as the rain continued to fall outside, Hercule Poirot knew that this case, strange, intricate, and mysterious, would require all of his skills. The game was afoot, and he would not rest until the final pieces of the puzzle were in place. Chapter 2. The First Clue. The Monarch Hotel stood at the corner of a quiet square, its imposing facade softened by the golden glow of street lamps reflecting off the rain-slicked pavement. The building, a remnant of a bygone era, exuded an air of grandeur that had long since faded into an atmosphere of hushed elegance. Inside, a faint aroma of polished wood mingled with the crisp scent of freshly laundered linens. A sanctuary of comfort that now bore the unsettling weight of a dark mystery. Hercule Poirot, accompanied by his steadfast associate, Inspector Catchpool from Scotland Yard, entered the hotel's lobby with an air of composed efficiency. His polished shoes clicked softly against the marble floors as he surveyed the space with his usual scrutiny. The lobby was quiet, save for the muffled murmur of distant conversations in the adjoining rooms. The grandeur of the place did little to mask the tension that hung thick in the air. There was a certain stillness, as if the hotel itself was holding its breath, waiting for Poirot to uncover the secrets it harbored. Poirot's keen eyes flicked towards the desk, where the receptionist, a thin woman with sharp features, looked up as they approached. She gave them a nervous nod and led them towards the stairs, not daring to speak above a whisper. The first victim, Harriet Sipple, had been discovered in room 305, her body lying in a symmetrical position on the bed, her arms at her sides, her legs arranged as if carefully placed, her mouth holding a cufflink, the initials P.I.J. engraved in gold. The pattern was too precise, too deliberate, to be the work of an ordinary killer. Poirot glanced at Catchpool, who was trailing behind, his usually composed face now betraying the unease he felt. "It is as if," Poirot said quietly, "the murderer wished to leave a signature, a mark of his work, a clue for us. You see it, yes, my friend? The symmetry, the careful placement of each body, and the identical cufflinks, not random. This is a planned act, a man with control." Catchpool nodded, though he clearly struggled to put his thoughts into words. "It's unnerving, Poirot. 3 deaths, all in the same hotel, and all so precise. What kind of man does that?" Poirot's face remained impassive, but in his mind the pieces of the puzzle were already beginning to shift into place. He was acutely aware of the small but significant details that others might overlook: the room number, the time of death, the placement of the bodies. It was these little clues that would eventually reveal the truth, as they always did. "Precision, Catchpool," Poirot replied, his voice measured, "is often the hallmark of a person who finds comfort in order, a person who seeks to control his surroundings and by extension the people within it. It is not the act of a random killer, no, it is the work of someone who believes in structure, in rules." The 2 men reached room 305, where a uniformed officer stood guard at the door. The officer stepped aside as Poirot and Catchpool entered the room. Harriet Sippel's body lay on the bed, just as it had been found days earlier. Her eyes closed, her features serene in death, but the pallor of her skin and the unnatural stillness of her body spoke of the violence that had been done to her. Poirot's eyes swept over the scene methodically, taking in every detail. The room was impeccably tidy, the bed neatly made, and on the nightstand beside her was a half-empty glass of wine. Nothing seemed out of place except for the disturbing symmetry of the body, the lifeless figure arranged as though a meticulous hand had positioned it for some unsettling purpose. Poirot bent down to examine the cufflink in her mouth, lifting it delicately between his fingers. "This," he muttered, "is the clue that binds the 3 victims. This, my friend, is the thread that will lead us to the murderer." Catchpool stepped closer, his gaze fixating on the gold cufflink. "It seems strange to me, Poirot. A cufflink in her mouth? Why not something more typical? A knife, a gun, something that might explain the violence of it all." Poirot stood up, his gaze still fixed on the cufflink. "It is not the violence that concerns the killer, Catchpool. It is the message he wishes to send. The placement of the cufflink is deliberate, a personal signature, a way of asserting control. The killer has orchestrated this entire scene, down to the smallest detail." "Do you think this person is connected to the victims in some way?" Catchpool asked, his brow furrowed. Was this something personal? Poirot straightened, his eyes scanning the room once more. "Perhaps. But the key to this mystery lies not in the violence, but in the order, the precision. These victims were not chosen randomly. No, they are linked by something else, something more hidden, more elusive. And that, my friend, is where we must begin our search." As Poirot and Catchpool examined the room further, they discovered that the other 2 victims, Ida Grensbury and Richard Negus, had died in similar circumstances. Their bodies, too, had been positioned with care, their mouths holding identical cufflinks. All 3 had checked into the hotel independently on the same day, a seemingly innocuous coincidence that Poirot knew was anything but. The detective's mind raced, connecting dots, considering every possibility. The victims had no apparent ties to one another, yet the pattern was unmistakable. They had all ordered food and drink to their rooms before their deaths, a commonality that suggested the killer had taken great care to ensure that each victim would be alone when the fatal blow was struck. It was clear that the murders had been carefully planned, timed with uncanny precision between 7 p.m. and 8:30 p.m. Poirot's brow furrowed as he turned to Catchpool. There is something more to these victims than meets the eye, something beyond the obvious. All three checked in on the same day, ordered food, and were then killed under similar circumstances. But why? What connects them? Catchpool opened a notebook, jotting down notes. They all arrived on Wednesday, he murmured. But what does that tell us? Poirot nodded slowly, his mind whirring with possibilities. Ah, Catchpool, it is not enough to look at the facts in isolation. We must see the connections between them. The victims, the timing, the letters, P.I.J., they all form part of a larger picture. The answer lies in the details, as always. Poirot paused, his gaze turning back to the body on the bed. The killer is sending us a message. The question is, what is it? Catchpool looked puzzled, but Poirot's sharp eyes were already tracing the invisible lines that link the murders, the victims, and the mysterious monogram. Every clue, no matter how small, would lead them to the truth. And Poirot was certain he would find that truth, piece by meticulous piece. As the two men stood in the silent room, Poirot's thoughts turned to the next step in the investigation. There was a connection waiting to be uncovered, and he was determined to follow it, no matter where it led. Chapter 3. Uncovering Connections. The early morning mist had not yet fully lifted when Hercule Poirot set out for the small, seemingly inconspicuous village of Great Holling. His train journey was silent, save for the gentle click of the tracks beneath him, each rhythmic sound a reminder of how small details could lead to larger truths. For Poirot, it was the smallest of details that often uncovered the most hidden of connections. The atmosphere of the train carriage was quiet, reserved, a fitting place for a detective lost in thought, yet one whose mind never ceased to whirl with possibilities. His neatly pressed coat rested across his lap, his hands clasped, ready for the next step in his investigation. The murders at the Monarch Hotel, which had so intrigued him, had brought him to a crossroads. The victims, Harriet Sipple, Ida Grensbury, and Richard Negus, though their deaths had been separate, had, upon further reflection, shown strange links that seemed far too deliberate to be ignored. It was this very connection that Poirot intended to unravel. As the train passed through the misty countryside, Poirot found himself reviewing the small but significant details that had begun to surface during his investigation. Richard Negus, he recalled, had once been engaged to Ida Grensbury. Their romance had been short-lived and ended bitterly, though no one had quite understood the true reason for the breakup. Harriet Sipple, meanwhile, had been involved in a business venture with Richard Negus years before, a partnership that had not ended particularly well either. These intertwined relationships, though distant in time, still seemed to ripple through the present, a subtle but undeniable force. Poirot's mind flicked to the mysterious clue that had first intrigued him. The initials P.I.J. Each victim had been found with the same monogrammed cufflink in their mouth, an eerie and deliberate symbol that was impossible to overlook. But there was more to this puzzle, more than just the cold, precise murder scenes and the peculiar clue. The victims had all crossed paths with someone, a figure whose name began with the letter P. Who was this person, and what role did they play in the tragic deaths? The train finally pulled into the small station at Great Holling, where the fog hung thick over the sleepy village. A few distant houses were scattered along the hillside, and a quaint pub stood at the village's centre, its brick walls covered with ivy that seemed to hold the building together as much as the age-old beams that supported its roof. Poirot stepped down from the train, the cold air sharp against his skin, and proceeded towards the heart of the village, where he would begin his search for answers. He had made arrangements to meet with a local historian, Mrs. Agnes Barton, who, according to his research, knew more about the village's past than most. It was said that she had been a childhood friend of Richard Negus, and Poirot hoped she could shed light on the dynamics of the village and its ties to the three victims. Mrs. Barton's cottage sat at the far end of the village, an old, creaky house filled with the scent of wood smoke and the sound of faint ticking clocks. The windows were small, their panes framed by heavy curtains that blocked out much of the morning light. Mrs. Barton herself was a woman of middle age with a sharp mind and an even sharper tongue according to those who had crossed her path. She greeted Poirot with a curt nod, ushering him inside. "Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice slightly hoarse but confident, "I know why you're here. You want to know about Richard Negus and his connections to this village. I'll tell you what I know, but you might not like it." Poirot smiled in that calm, patient way of his. "Mademoiselle Barton, I have no doubt that you possess knowledge that will be invaluable. It is my hope that you will not withhold anything, no matter how unpleasant it may seem." She eyed him suspiciously before sitting down in a well-worn armchair, pulling her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "Richard," she began, "was a complicated man. He came to Great Holling when he was just a lad, all those years ago. He was engaged to Ida Grensbury, of course, but that was never a match made in heaven. Ida's family was well off, and Richard thought he could do better for himself, but it didn't quite work out." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "So there was no love between them?" Mrs. Barton's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not love, no. Perhaps it started that way, but Richard, well, he had ambition, more than Ida could offer him, I suppose. And then there was Harriet Sipple." Poirot's brow furrowed. "Harriet Sipple?"
Harriet was a businesswoman, Mrs. Barton continued. "She ran a small, successful venture here for a time, and Richard worked with her. She was sharp, too sharp, perhaps, and Richard found her quite the intriguing person. But they had a falling out. It wasn't public knowledge, but they did not part on the best of terms." Poirot's mind worked swiftly, piecing these fragments together. It seemed that Richard had indeed made a series of enemies, or at the very least people with whom his relationships had soured over time. The bitterness between Richard and his former fiancée, Ida, and the fallout with Harriet Sipple painted a picture of a man who, though seemingly charming, had caused harm in his wake. "But who is this P figure?" Poirot asked, his voice quiet but firm. "I am certain that this is a person who holds the key to understanding the victim's connections." Mrs. Barton was silent for a long while, staring out the window as if considering her next words carefully. Finally, she spoke, her voice softer now. "There was someone from Richard's past, a man named Philip Jennings. He was a childhood friend of Richard's, someone who grew up alongside him in the village. But Jennings disappeared years ago, around the time Richard began working with Harriet Sipple. Some said he had gone abroad, some said he'd fallen into a bad crowd. But what I do know is this: Richard and Philip had a falling out of their own. There was talk of money, business deals gone sour, and I think Jennings might have held a grudge." Poirot felt a slight chill run down his spine. "A grudge," he murmured. "A dangerous one, if it led to murder." "Perhaps," Mrs. Barton replied. "But I don't know for sure. All I can tell you is that Jennings had a hand in shaping Richard's life, and I think he's the key to it all." Poirot rose from his chair, his mind racing with new possibilities. "Jennings," he repeated. "Philip Jennings. The connection is clearer now, but why would someone like him leave a monogrammed cufflink with the initials P.I.J.? And why choose these victims?"
Mrs. Barton stood, her expression filled with concern. "I wish I could tell you more, Mr. Poirot, but this village is full of secrets. If you dig too deeply, you might uncover more than you bargained for." Poirot gave a small, knowing smile. "Mademoiselle Barton, I have spent my life uncovering secrets. I assure you, the deeper we dig, the closer we will get to the truth." As Poirot left the cottage and made his way back to the village, the puzzle pieces seemed to shift, each new discovery bringing him closer to the answer. Philip Jennings was no longer a shadow in the distance. He was a name, one that would unlock the next step in the investigation. The connections were becoming clearer, but the mystery was far from solved. And Hercule Poirot, with his characteristic calm and determination, knew that he would uncover every last detail, no matter how deep the secrets ran. Chapter 4: Jenny's Secrets. The chill of early evening had settled into the streets of London, with mist creeping like a grey shroud around the buildings. Hercule Poirot stepped lightly through the fog, his boots making scarcely a sound on the cobblestones, his coat trailing behind him as he moved with characteristic precision. The world around him felt still, suspended in a moment of quiet anticipation. The mystery at the Monarch Hotel had already captivated him, and now, it seemed, the next piece of the puzzle was about to reveal itself. Poirot was on his way to meet Jenny Hobbs once more. The cryptic woman, whose frantic warning had planted a seed of doubt in his mind, had agreed to meet him privately at a small cafe near Covent Garden. She had insisted that she was in danger, that the killer was after her, and though Poirot had initially been inclined to dismiss her claims as mere hysteria, he could not help but feel there was more to her story. Jenny's fear was palpable, and her insistence on secrecy only made her presence more compelling. When he arrived, he found the cafe almost deserted. A fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. The delicate scent of fresh coffee mingled with the earthy aroma of the wood burning in the fireplace. Jenny sat at a corner table, her back slightly hunched, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. She looked over her shoulder as Poirot entered, her expression anxious, as though she had been waiting too long for someone to appear. "Ah, mademoiselle," Poirot greeted her, his voice warm yet measured. He had not yet forgotten the urgency in her earlier words, but he also understood that people in distress often said too much or too little. It was his job to sift through the excess and uncover the truth. "I am happy to find you in good health. But tell me, how is it that you know the killer is after you? What can you tell me of this danger?" Jenny's eyes darted nervously to the door, and she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "I don't know how to explain it," she said. Her hands shook slightly as she set the cup down, and Poirot noticed the way she avoided meeting his gaze, a typical sign of someone hiding something. "But I know I'm next. It's not just a feeling, it's something more, something deeper." Poirot's gaze softened as he pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. He took a moment to consider her, studying the subtle tremor in her hands, the tightness in her posture. "You are convinced, then," he said gently, "that you have been marked by this killer. But why you? Why now?" Jenny glanced around once more, her voice lowering even further, as if to ensure they were not overheard. "It's about Richard Negus," she whispered, her eyes darting again toward the door. He was the one who gave me the cufflinks. I saw them before. He had a set. I know because I worked for him at the Monarch Hotel years ago. And then there was Nancy Duquesne. She was there too. I hated her for what she did." Poirot listened carefully, his mind already sifting through the layers of Jenny's story. Her words seemed to open a new chapter in the case, one filled with hidden emotions and complex relationships. "Nancy Duquesne?" Poirot repeated, raising an eyebrow. You knew her as well? I see. And what was it about Nancy Duquesne that caused such feelings of resentment, mademoiselle? Jenny's face hardened, and she finally met his gaze. She was everything I wasn't, she said, her voice thick with bitterness. She had Richard's attention, his admiration, and I couldn't stand it. I worked in the hotel for years. I was just a maid, and Nancy, she was rich, glamorous. Richard always spoke of her like she was a queen. I just wanted him to look at me that way. I wanted to be the one he admired, not her. Poirot noted the raw emotion in her voice, the jealousy, the resentment that had clearly been festering for years. And yet, as much as he sympathized with her feelings, he also saw the potential for danger in such emotions. I understand, Poirot said softly, choosing his words carefully. It seems that Nancy Duquesne was a woman of great significance to you and to Richard Negus. But tell me, mademoiselle, how does all this tie into the murders at the hotel? The cufflinks, the positioning of the bodies, what role do you play in all of this? Jenny's hands trembled more noticeably now, and she pushed the cup of tea aside, her gaze fixed on the table. I didn't want to be involved, she muttered. But I was. I saw things I shouldn't have seen. Richard was a part of something darker than I ever realized. And when I tried to leave the hotel, when I tried to walk away from him, he got angry. That's when the trouble started, the things I saw. I never told anyone, not even the police. But now, with the murders, I know they're all connected. Poirot studied her face intently, watching for the smallest flicker of truth. She seemed genuinely distressed, but there was a nagging feeling at the back of his mind, a suspicion that Jenny knew more than she was willing to admit. Her fear was palpable, but it was also a bit too convenient. Could it be that she was using her knowledge of the murders as a way to shield herself? Or was she truly in danger? Tell me, mademoiselle, Poirot said, his tone even but firm. Did you see anything that could lead us to the killer? Did you hear anything at all that might help us understand why these deaths have occurred? Jenny hesitated for a long moment, clearly weighing the consequences of what she might reveal. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a man. He came to the hotel one night not long before the murders. I didn't see his face, but I saw the cufflinks. I remember thinking, oh, those are the same. I think he was watching me, watching Richard. But when I tried to ask him about it, he vanished. Poirot leaned forward slightly, intrigued by this new development. A man? Could you describe him? What did he look like? Jenny shook her head. I didn't see him clearly. He was always in the shadows, but the cufflinks, they were the same. The initials P.I.J., I saw them again, just like on the bodies. Poirot's eyes gleamed. This man you speak of, do you think he is the killer? Jenny's eyes widened, her face pale. I don't know, she whispered. But I'm afraid I think he's the one who's been watching me. And I think he's the one who's going to kill me next. Poirot took a deep breath, his mind turning rapidly. He had been right to be suspicious of Jenny. There was more to her involvement in this case than met the eye. Her knowledge of the cufflinks, her connection to Richard Negus, her feelings toward Nancy Duquesne, all of these elements painted a picture of a woman with far more information than she had let on. And yet, despite the darkness of the secrets Jenny was keeping, Poirot could not ignore the genuine fear in her eyes. He could not deny the possibility that she was in fact in danger. But who was this mysterious man she spoke of? And what role did he play in the web of murder and deceit that seemed to have ensnared the victims at the Monarch Hotel? Poirot stood slowly, his gaze lingering on Jenny. Mademoiselle, I will take your concerns seriously. But you must understand, I cannot simply accept your fears without more evidence. You must trust me as I trust you to reveal everything you know." Jenny nodded, her eyes wide with apprehension. "I'll tell you everything, Poirot, I swear it." Poirot gave her a reassuring smile, though the concern in his eyes remained. "Good, because I believe that you know more than you think you do." As Poirot left the cafe, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, but the picture was still blurry. Jenny had given him important clues, but her fear and her emotions seemed to be clouding her judgment. The killer was close, perhaps closer than any of them realized. And Poirot knew that in order to stop him, he would have to untangle the web of lies, jealousy, and betrayal that bound the victims together. For now, all he could do was follow the thread and hope it would lead him to the truth. Chapter 5. The Symmetry of Death. The room was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the wooden floors and the faint whisper of wind against the glass windows. The Monarch Hotel had become an eerie setting, its once imposing grandeur now overshadowed by the horrors that had unfolded within its walls. Poirot, ever the meticulous observer, had taken to moving through its hallways with a calculated grace, his mind as sharp and focused as ever. Each detail mattered, each seemingly insignificant clue could be the key to unlocking the mystery that had so confounded Scotland Yard. The body of Richard Negus had been found here, in room 304, and it was here that Poirot had returned, determined to discover more about the precise and methodical nature of the murder. His eyes took in the room with a practiced glance, its muted color scheme, the heavy curtains that blocked out the light, and the neatness that contradicted the violence that had occurred within these walls. Everything was in its place, yet it all felt wrong. Poirot paused in the center of the room, his eyes narrowing slightly as he began to take stock of the scene. Catchpool, following closely behind, seemed tense, his gaze moving nervously from corner to corner. "It's all wrong, Poirot," Catchpool muttered, his voice low. "This doesn't feel like the work of a common murderer. It's too deliberate." Poirot, always calm and composed, gave a slight nod of agreement. "That is precisely it, mon ami. It is not random, no. This is not a killer simply acting out of rage or necessity. This is someone who has a plan, someone who wants to send a message." Catchpool's eyes flicked to the body, still under the sheets where it had been left, precisely positioned, arms folded, legs neatly aligned, just as it had been in the other victims. A message? But to whom? Poirot's eyes were already scanning the room again, this time focusing on the floor. "A message, yes," he murmured. "The killer leaves a signature, an imprint of his work. We must look closely, mon ami. The devil is always in the details." Poirot's foot brushed the edge of the rug beneath him, and his eyes suddenly narrowed. "Ah! What have we here?" Crouching, he lifted the rug with a precise motion, his fingers deftly moving across the fibers until he found something hidden beneath. A small metal object, a key. He picked it up with care, turning it over between his fingers. "This is no ordinary key," Poirot said softly, more to himself than to Catchpool. "This is a key to something hidden, something secret." Catchpool stepped forward, peering at the key. "What do you think it unlocks, Poirot?" Poirot stood up slowly, holding the key out for Catchpool to see. "It is not important just yet, but what is important is this. Someone has used the layout of this hotel, its architecture, to escape unnoticed. This key, it seems, belongs to a room, a place that may hold further answers." Poirot's mind was already working, putting the pieces together. The fact that the murderer had left no sign of struggle in Richard Negus's room, the symmetry of the body, the precise way in which the victims had been arranged, This was no impulsive crime. This was the work of someone who understood how to control the environment around them, someone who knew how to move undetected. Catchpool, we must search this hotel further. This key, I suspect, will lead us to something important, Poirot said with quiet determination. The murderer used the corridors, the rooms, the very architecture of this building as a means of escape. This is someone who thinks ahead, someone who plans everything to the smallest detail. The two men continued their search, moving methodically through the room, turning over every piece of furniture, checking every drawer. It was Catchpool who found the next clue. A small envelope tucked away beneath the desk, almost hidden by the weight of the papers that littered the surface. He handed it to Poirot, who examined it carefully. "Ah, but of course," Poirot murmured as he opened the envelope. Inside, there was a short note, scrawled hastily in ink. "The perfect arrangement. Death is only the beginning." Catchpool frowned, looking from the note to Poirot. "What does that mean? What is the killer trying to say?" Poirot held the note up to the light, his eyes scanning the words with a focused intensity. "It is not just about the deaths. No, this killer, he is obsessed with perfection, with control. The arrangement of the bodies, the precise way in which they are placed, it is all part of a larger design. The killer believes he is creating something perfect, something that cannot be undone." Poirot's voice grew softer but no less certain. "This is a message, Catchpool, not just to us, but to the world. A world that is out of balance, a world that must be corrected." Catchpool shifted uncomfortably. "So the bodies are the beginning of something? The killer is sending a message about death?" Poirot nodded. "Yes. The killer has a vision of order, and death is merely the first step toward achieving that order." The two men continued their investigation, moving through the hotel with renewed purpose. Every room was examined with the same precision, every corridor scrutinized for the smallest detail that might provide the next clue. It was in the hotel's library that Poirot finally found something that he had been hoping for, a map of the building, a floor plan that would reveal hidden corridors and secret rooms. He studied the map closely, his finger tracing the outlines of the rooms and hallways. "Look here, Catchpool," Poirot said, pointing to a small, inconspicuous door near the back of the building. "This is a private office, perhaps a place where the staff kept their personal effects. It is a dead end, but it could be the key to understanding how the murderer moved through the hotel." Catchpool nodded, his brow furrowed. "So the killer used hidden passageways to escape?" "Exactly," Poirot replied. "It is the perfect method, isn't it? The layout of the building allows for movement in secrecy, undetected by anyone who might be watching. The killer could have entered and exited without leaving a trace." Poirot paused, considering the implications of what he had discovered. The symmetry of the murders, the positioning of the bodies, it all makes sense now. The killer is obsessed with control, with order. He has studied the hotel's layout, learned how to use it to his advantage, the perfect arrangement as the note said, and now the key to this secret passage is in our hands. Catchpool's face was a mixture of awe and unease. "So we're looking for someone who's not just clever, but also calculating, someone who planned everything down to the smallest detail." Poirot nodded, his gaze turning to the door, as though he could already see the killer standing there, waiting. A person with an obsessive need for control, a person who believes that only through death can the world be set right, and someone who has carefully orchestrated every step of this, someone who believes that the symmetry of their work is a work of art. Poirot stood up, his mind already racing ahead, considering the next step in the investigation. The murderer was not just a random killer. He was an artist, and death was his canvas. Every detail, every action was part of a grand design, and Poirot knew that it was only a matter of time before he would uncover the truth. "We must find the killer," Poirot said, his voice quiet but filled with resolve. "The key to stopping him lies in understanding his need for symmetry, his obsession with perfection." With that, Poirot turned, leading Catchpool through the halls of the Monarch Hotel. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly falling into place, and Poirot knew that he was closing in on the answer. The symmetry of death, the obsession with order, was the key to the killer's mind. And once he understood that, he would be able to stop him. Chapter 6. The Mysterious Note. The quiet stillness of the Monarch Hotel's reception area seemed to stretch endlessly, a hushed, almost haunted atmosphere that weighed heavily on the air. The flickering gas lamps cast their soft golden glow across the room, illuminating the polished mahogany counter and the lavish, yet somewhat dated furniture. The hotel was a place caught between its former elegance and the shadow of something darker that had recently descended upon it. Hercule Poirot stood at the reception desk, his hands folded neatly in front of him as his sharp eyes scanned every detail of the space. The scent of old wood and lavender lingered in the air, the very essence of the hotel's storied history. The receptionist, a young woman with a pleasant face but a nervous demeanor, stood off to the side, barely meeting Poirot's gaze. She had grown accustomed to his presence by now, and yet she knew, as everyone else did, that Poirot's interest in the events unfolding at the Monarch could not be overlooked. Poirot's mind was racing, each thought meticulously catalogued and examined. He had spent the last few days piecing together the clues of the murders, 3 victims each found in their rooms under strikingly similar circumstances, each linked by the enigmatic initials P.I.J., and now it seemed the killer had left a message, a note, another clue that would unlock the mystery that had baffled Scotland Yard and eluded Poirot for far too long. The receptionist, noticing his intent gaze, spoke in a voice that was barely a whisper, as though reluctant to disturb the weight of the silence. "Sir," she said, there's something you should see." "It was left for you underneath the register book just here." Her fingers trembled as she indicated a small, folded piece of paper tucked carefully beneath the leather-bound guest book. Poirot's eyebrows arched slightly, but his expression remained calm. "Ah, you have done well, mademoiselle. Allow me to take a look at it." He took the note from the counter with a smooth, practiced motion, unfolding it carefully as though it were a delicate object rather than an ordinary piece of paper. The message inside was brief, its writing bold and sharp, almost aggressive in its clarity. The words, written in ink, were a riddle of sorts, cryptic and taunting. "Perfection is what I seek, a perfect arrangement, the perfect symmetry of death. The game is not over. P.I.J. will reveal all." Poirot's eyes glistened with concentration as he read the message twice, then a third time, his mind already at work, sifting through the possibilities. "Mon Dieu," he whispered to himself. A riddle, and yet more than that, a challenge. The killer, he wants us to play his game, to follow his trail. Catchpool, who had been standing nearby, glanced at the note in Poirot's hands. "A note from the killer?" he asked, his voice low with suspicion. Poirot nodded, his eyes never leaving the message. "It seems that way, my friend. The note is a taunt, a challenge. It is the killer's way of communicating with us to make us see what he wants us to see. The initials P.I.J. are not random, no, they are part of the puzzle. They are a deliberate clue." Catchpool frowned, confused. But what do they mean, Poirot? What is the significance of these initials? Poirot's lips curled into a thin smile, a smile that held the unmistakable sign of understanding. Ah, that is the key to this case, Catchpool. You see, Keeked P.I.J. is not just a random set of letters, number. They are a message, carefully crafted, as deliberate as the killer's actions. The symmetry, the order, it is all part of the plan. He turned the note over in his hands, examining the back with a careful eye, as though searching for something hidden there. We must think beyond the obvious. The initials could stand for a name, a place, or perhaps something more abstract. But they are not here by chance. The killer's message is meant to be deciphered. Catchpool shifted uneasily. But how do we know what it means, Poirot? This could be just another wild goose chase. Poirot's gaze softened, though his focus remained intense. It is not a wild goose chase, my friend. It is a puzzle, one that can only be solved by understanding the mind of the murderer. A mind that thrives on symmetry, on control, on the perfection of its own design. Poirot paused, his thoughts drifting, as he considered the note. The cryptic nature of the message sent ripples of anticipation through his mind. The killer was clearly intelligent, precise in his actions, and he wanted his crimes to be understood. The perfection he sought was not just in the arrangement of his victims, but in the narrative he was crafting, one that, in the end, would make sense to those who could see the pattern. "Aha!" Poirot exclaimed suddenly, his voice rising with excitement. "It is clear now. Perfection, symmetry, it is the language the killer speaks, the bodies, arranged with such precision, each one positioned just so. This is the key. The killer is an artist of death, and the initials P.I.J. are his signature." Catchpool looked at him with growing understanding. "So you think the initials belong to someone, or something specific?" Poirot nodded, his mind now completely absorbed by the puzzle. "Yes, but we must be careful. The killer has left us a trail, but it is not one that will lead us directly to him. We must think, mon ami. Think of anyone or anything that could be associated with these initials. A person, a place, perhaps a symbol of some kind." Catchpool scratched his head, looking uncertain. "I'm not sure what to make of it, Poirot, but I trust you. If anyone can make sense of this, it's you." Poirot smiled at the compliment, but his expression quickly turned serious. "We are getting closer, Catchpool. Every step, every clue. This is how we find the truth. We must not be distracted by the apparent simplicity of the message. The killer has given us a clue, but it is up to us to decipher it." With that, Poirot folded the note carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. "We will return to the hotel, mon ami. We will search for more clues, and we will speak to those who knew the victims, anyone who might have information that will help us solve this riddle." As Poirot and Catchpool turned to leave the reception area, Poirot's mind was already racing with possibilities. The note was not just a clue, it was a challenge, an invitation to solve the puzzle the killer had set before them. The initials P.I.J. could mean anything, and yet they were undeniably important. Poirot was convinced of that. There was a deeper connection between the victims, a link that tied them to the killer in ways that had not yet become clear, and Poirot was determined to find it. The investigation continued, with Poirot leading Catchpool through a series of interviews with hotel staff, friends of the victims, and anyone else who might have insight into the lives of those who had been murdered. Each conversation added another layer to the mystery, but none of the answers seemed to fit perfectly. Poirot, however, was unperturbed. He had dealt with far more complex cases, and his faith in the little grey cells had never failed him. The killer had left them a trail that could now be followed with precision. The next step would come soon enough. The killer's message was clear. They were playing a game, and Hercule Poirot was ready to meet the challenge head-on. In the end, Poirot knew that he would uncover the truth behind the initials P.I.J. and the methodical madness of the killer. The game, as the note suggested, was not over, not by a long shot, and Hercule Poirot was prepared to bring it to its inevitable conclusion. Chapter 7. The Final Dinner. The soft clinking of fine china and silverware echoed through the quiet halls of the Monarch Hotel, as if the very walls whispered of secrets buried deep within. The dining room, though elegant in its simplicity, was not the place one would normally associate with tragedy. Yet it had been the scene of a fateful gathering, a dinner that had, unknown to its guests, sealed their destinies. Hercule Poirot stood at the entrance of the dining room, his keen eyes scanning the meticulously arranged tables, the quiet flicker of candlelight casting shadows across the linen tablecloths. The room was empty now, its guests long gone, but the echoes of their final meal lingered in the air. The investigation had taken many twists and turns since the deaths of Richard Negus, Ida Grensbury, and Harriet Sipple, but it was this dinner, their final gathering, that now occupied Poirot's thoughts. He had discovered that the three victims, though from different walks of life, had been brought together under the most peculiar circumstances. A scheduled meal at the hotel's dining room, arranged by someone or something whose influence was still unclear. Poirot's mind raced as he replayed the details of the evening. The dinner had been an ordinary affair, at least on the surface. There had been no signs of discord between the victims, no heated arguments, no visible tension. Yet Poirot knew that appearances could be deceiving. He had seen enough in his years of investigation to know that the simplest of events often held the key to unraveling the most complex of mysteries. As he walked deeper into the room, his eyes were drawn to a small detail near the center of the table, a single glass of sherry, untouched, sitting alone by Richard Negus's place setting. Poirot's sharp gaze lingered on the glass for a moment longer than it should have. Why was it still there? The glass was half full, as though Richard had set it down and walked away. Yet the others had left the dining room together, and the glass remained, as though it had been forgotten. Poirot's fingers gently brushed the rim of the glass, his mind working through the possibilities. A glass of sherry. It seemed innocent enough, but Poirot knew that in a case like this, no detail could be dismissed without thorough consideration. Why had Richard, the victim of the most recent murder, left his drink behind? It could be a trivial oversight, nothing more than a momentary lapse, or it could be something far more significant. "Catchpool?" Poirot said, turning toward his companion, who had followed him into the dining room. "Come here, mon ami, and examine this with me." Catchpool, still in his usual state of mild confusion, approached cautiously, glancing at the glass. "What is it, Poirot? A glass of sherry?" "Exactly," Poirot replied, his tone measured. "But why is it here? Why has it been left behind, untouched, when Richard had already left the dinner?" "I believe it is no mere accident. The killer's plan, you see, has not been completed simply with the deaths themselves. The dinner, this meeting, was orchestrated. Richard Negus, like the others, was brought here for a reason, and this glass, this small detail, gives us a clue." Catchpool raised an eyebrow. "A clue in a glass of sherry?" "Ah, yes, my friend," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming with the excitement of discovery. "This glass is out of place, not merely because it is abandoned, but because it does not belong to the dinner itself. The killer arranged the victims to be together, yes, but this glass was intended for a different purpose. Richard was meant to be the one to drink it, but he did not." "Why?" Catchpool was silent for a moment, considering Poirot's words. "Do you think it was poisoned?" Poirot gave a slow nod. That is one possibility. The timing of the murders suggests careful planning, and this glass, left behind in such a manner, may well indicate that Richard was meant to be incapacitated before the others. Perhaps it was meant to make him vulnerable, a drink that would have made him weak, thus allowing the killer to strike with ease. But he didn't drink it, Catchpool said, finally understanding. So the killer was forced to kill him differently. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on the glass. Yes, but why did the killer leave it behind? Was it a failed attempt? Or was it something else? The absence of the glass could be just as telling as its presence. Poirot stood silently for a moment, contemplating the possibilities. His mind flicked back to the victims: Harriet Sipple, Ida Grensbury, and Richard Negus. All had been part of the same meal, and all had been killed with the same methodical precision. The clue, Poirot realized, was in the killer's need for order and symmetry. Each death had been carefully arranged, as though the killer had been writing a letter, each victim a word, each movement a punctuation mark. The dinner, Poirot said, turning to Catchpool with renewed clarity, was not simply a meal. It was part of the plan. The killer wanted to bring them together, to place them in the same room, where they could be eliminated one by one. But the glass of sherry, left behind in this manner, suggests that something went awry. Perhaps Richard was supposed to die first, but the killer's plan was altered. A failure, but not an irredeemable one. Catchpool took a deep breath, stepping back as the weight of Poirot's words sank in. So the killer had a different plan for each of them? Precisely, Poirot replied, his voice soft with the thrill of the chase. Each victim was meant to be taken in turn, each death a carefully timed step toward a greater purpose. But Richard's death did not go as planned, and yet the symmetry remained. Each victim was found arranged in the same manner, no deviation, no mistake. The killer was in control of the situation, even when things did not go according to the initial plan. But why these three? Catchpool asked, his brow furrowed. Why Richard, Ida, and Harriet? That, Poirot said, his voice thoughtful, is the question we must answer. Each one of them had a connection to Richard Negus, but the relationship between them remains unclear. The jealousy, the broken engagements, the betrayals, all of these emotions simmered beneath the surface, but what was the catalyst? Why did the killer choose them? Poirot turned back to the table, his mind once again racing through the details. The dinner had been the perfect setting for the murders, a gathering of three people whose pasts were interwoven with Richard's. They had been brought together for a reason, but it was still not entirely clear what that reason was. The cufflink, Poirot murmured. The monogram. It is not just a clue, it is a signature. The killer wants us to understand something. He is playing a game with us, Catchpool. A game of perfection, of symmetry. Catchpool watched Poirot, his expression one of quiet fascination. You think the killer's choice of victims was deliberate? That they were all connected to Richard in some way? Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, Richard was the key. But not just because of his involvement with the victims. No, Richard's life was a series of broken relationships, all tied together by bitterness and jealousy. Someone close to these events has been watching, waiting for the right moment to exact revenge. Catchpool looked around the room, his thoughts clearly churning. So, you think the killer wanted revenge? And that revenge was against all three of them? Poirot smiled softly, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of certainty and intrigue. The killer is not merely seeking vengeance, Number. He is correcting what he perceives as wrong. He is creating his own form of order. And when the last piece falls into place, Catchpool, we will see that the killer's motives were as clear as the glass of sherry left behind. As Poirot and Catchpool stood in the quiet dining room, surrounded by the remnants of a meal that had been anything but ordinary, Poirot knew the truth was near. Each clue had brought him closer to understanding the killer's mind, and soon, very soon, the final piece would fall into place. Chapter 8. The Final Act. The evening air was thick with tension as Hercule Poirot made his way back to the Monarch Hotel, the scene of the crime and the labyrinth of mysteries that had consumed his every thought for the past week. The grand yet aged building seemed quieter now, its once proud halls holding their breath as if awaiting the final curtain to fall. Poirot's movements were steady, deliberate, his mind piecing together every fragment of the case, every detail that had once seemed inconsequential but now formed a complete picture of the killer's plan. The events leading to this moment had all been leading to one inescapable conclusion. The killer was closer than anyone had imagined, hiding in plain sight, weaving a complex web of deception and manipulation. The victims, Harriet Sipple, Ida Grensbury, and Richard Negus, had all been players in a tragic game, each of them connected by long-forgotten secrets and past grievances. And yet, none of them had suspected the true culprit, someone who had, quite cleverly, orchestrated each murder to cover up a long-buried crime. As Poirot approached the entrance of the hotel, he glanced up at the facade, his sharp gaze noting the shadows that clung to the windows. The place had witnessed its fair share of intrigue over the years, but this case, with its chilling precision and methodical cruelty, would be one it would never forget. The mystery had consumed him, pulling him deeper into the lives of the victims, uncovering their darkest secrets, and revealing the true nature of the killer's obsession. Poirot stepped into the lobby, the sound of his polished shoes on the marble floor echoing through the vast space. Catchpool, ever loyal, was waiting near the reception desk, looking as though he had not slept in days. The inspector's face was a study of exhaustion, but there was also a sense of relief that seemed to emanate from him, relief that the end was near. "You have everything, Poirot?" Catchpool asked, his voice low, but with an unmistakable edge of curiosity. Poirot gave a small nod, his face unreadable. "I have everything, my friend. The puzzle is now complete, but the solution remains to be revealed." Catchpool raised an eyebrow, clearly expecting Poirot to elaborate. "Who is it, Poirot?" "Who's the killer?" Poirot's eyes flicked towards the staircase that led to the upper floors. His voice was calm, almost as if he was stating a simple fact. "The killer, mon ami, is someone who has been hiding in plain sight throughout this entire investigation. Someone with a connection to each of the victims, someone who used their knowledge of the past to manipulate the situation." Poirot's gaze settled on Catchpool, his expression intense. "The killer is not an outsider. He has been right here, within this hotel, all along." Catchpool looked confused, but Poirot was already turning towards the back of the hotel, his mind working furiously as he retraced the steps that had brought him to this point. It had been days since Jenny Hobbs's revelation, and the final pieces had been falling into place, each clue leading Poirot closer to the truth. He had known from the start that the murders were not random, that they had been meticulously planned and executed. The presence of the cufflinks in the victims' mouths, the careful symmetry of the bodies and the cryptic messages left behind. All of these pointed to a killer who desired control, who had a deep obsession with order. But it was the final dinner, their last meal together, that had revealed the most telling clue. It had been there, in the discarded glass of sherry, where Poirot had first begun to understand. The killer had tried to make Richard Negus vulnerable, to disable him with a poisoned drink, but Richard had not taken it. The killer's plan had failed, and from that moment on, everything had been set into motion. Poirot's attention had then shifted to the hidden key found beneath Richard's rug, an object that had suggested a secret passage, an escape route used by the murderer to elude detection. Each clue had been carefully placed, each action orchestrated to perfection. But the breakthrough came when Poirot had confronted Jenny with the truth about the victim's connections. She had played a part in the killer's plan, unknowingly aiding the murderer by feeding him information about the victim's habits and movements. Her fear had been real, but it was rooted in her own guilt. Guilt over her unintentional role in the deaths of those she had once known. Yet her revelation had provided Poirot with the final piece of the puzzle, the killer's true motive. As Poirot made his way to the hotel's back office, where the final confrontation would take place, his mind was calm, focused. He knew the killer's identity now. The killer had been hiding in plain sight, using their position within the hotel to manipulate and control the victims. But the killer's motivation had been more than just revenge. It had been about silencing those who knew too much about a crime long buried. The back office was dimly lit, the faint glow from a single lamp casting long shadows across the room. Poirot stepped inside, his presence commanding, yet there was a quiet intensity in his movements. He was prepared for the confrontation, his mind already anticipating every move. As he turned to face the person standing at the far side of the room, Poirot's gaze softened just slightly, though his voice remained as precise as ever. Monsieur Richard's legacy was one of manipulation, of deceit, Poirot said, his voice cool. But it is not only his that has caused these deaths, is it? No, there is more to this story. There is something far darker at play here. The figure standing before him, cloaked in shadow, stiffened at the sound of Poirot's voice. A flicker of recognition passed across their face, quickly hidden, but Poirot had seen it. The subtle tightening of the jaw, the brief flash of fear. "You've been playing a game, haven't you?" Poirot continued, his gaze unyielding. "Using the victims' connections, their pasts, as pawns, and all the while you've been hiding in plain sight, watching as the pieces fell into place." The figure remained silent, but the tension in the room was palpable. Poirot's eyes never wavered as he continued, his words cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "You wanted to silence them all, didn't you? They knew too much. They were too close to the truth. And you couldn't allow that, could you? You couldn't allow their secrets to be exposed." A sudden movement broke the stillness, and Poirot's keen eyes followed the figure's every gesture as they stepped into the light. The person before him was not what Poirot had expected, not the vengeful accomplice of Richard Negus, but someone much closer to the case than anyone had realized. "It was you," Poirot said softly, his voice filled with quiet certainty. "You were the one pulling the strings all along." The figure let out a soft laugh, a bitter sound that echoed in the quiet room. "You're clever, Poirot," they said, their voice laced with resignation. "You're right. It was me. But you don't understand, do you? I wasn't trying to hurt them. I was trying to protect something, someone, something that could never be allowed to see the light of day again." Poirot's expression softened, though his mind was already piecing together the last bits of the story. A crime, long buried, hidden in the past. Something Richard and the others knew, something that threatened to ruin you. And so you used them, you manipulated them, and when they became too dangerous, they had to be silenced, the figure finished for him, their voice a mixture of defiance and regret. It was the only way. Poirot took a step forward, his gaze unflinching. "But the truth, monsieur, always comes to light. It is only a matter of time before the secrets you've buried are unearthed. The game is over." With those words, Poirot stood tall, the resolution of the case now within his grasp. The killer's motives were clear now: revenge, yes, but also the desire to bury a dark crime. The web of manipulation, deceit and control had come to its final act, and Poirot had exposed the murderer for what they truly were. The final curtain had fallen. The killer's identity had been revealed, and the truth was at last known. Chapter 9. The Unraveling of Secret. The darkened corridors of the Monarch Hotel echoed with silence as Hercule Poirot moved with deliberate calm through the building's labyrinthine halls. The case had stretched on for days, each revelation leading him closer to the killer, yet the final piece of the puzzle had eluded him until now. His mind, sharp and meticulous as always, had finally pieced together the final steps of the crime, and he knew that the truth was within his grasp. The victims, Harriet Sipple, Ida Grensbury and Richard Negus, had all played their parts in a tragedy long in the making. Each had been connected to Richard, though none had known the full extent of his manipulations or the secrets buried in the past. The monogrammed cufflinks, those seemingly insignificant details found in each victim's mouth, had been the key to unlocking the mystery. But now Poirot realized there was something more, something far deeper driving the killer's actions. He turned towards the back office where the final confrontation would take place, his mind focused and unyielding. The killer had been hiding in plain sight, using their knowledge of the victims' pasts to manipulate them and orchestrate their deaths. The obsession with symmetry, with control, had led to the murders, but the true motive was something far more complex. It was a need to protect a long-buried secret, a secret that could never be allowed to surface. As Poirot entered the room, he was greeted by the quiet figure standing in the shadows. The person before him seemed almost relieved, like a bird caught in a trap, waiting for the inevitable. Poirot's eyes scanned them carefully, noting the stillness, the way the figure's body language betrayed their sense of impending defeat. "You have been playing a dangerous game, monsieur," Poirot began, his voice steady and controlled. "But the game is over now. It is time for the truth to come to light." The figure shifted, a slight tension rippling through their frame, but they remained silent. Poirot continued, his gaze unyielding. "You have used your knowledge of Richard Negus's past, of his broken relationships, to manipulate events and orchestrate these murders. The victims did not deserve their fates, but you saw them as a threat. They were going to expose you, weren't they? They knew something about you, something that could destroy everything you've worked so hard to protect." The silence in the room was thick. Poirot's words hung in the air like a challenge, yet the killer remained motionless, unwilling to acknowledge the truth that was now undeniable. "Your obsession with order, with symmetry, is what led to their deaths," Poirot continued. "You wanted everything to be in its rightful place, no surprises, no deviations. The bodies, arranged with such care, each victim placed in the same way, were part of your plan. But you failed to see one thing, monsieur. The plan could never remain flawless. You underestimated the power of the truth." The figure's face hardened, but Poirot could see the faintest flicker of recognition, the faintest sign that they were beginning to crack under the pressure. The detective moved forward, his steps precise and deliberate, as though he were a surgeon about to make the final incision. "You wanted to silence them," Poirot said, his voice lowering slightly, "but the truth always finds a way to be heard. You cannot bury it forever." The figure's lips parted, and for the first time, a hint of emotion flickered in their eyes. "You don't understand," they murmured, their voice tight with frustration. "I had to do it. They were going to ruin everything. They knew too much. If they had spoken, Everything I've worked for, everything I've built, it would have been destroyed. Poirot's gaze softened, though his mind remained razor-sharp. Yes, monsieur. You did not want your secrets exposed, but those secrets buried for so long could never stay hidden. The jealousy, the guilt, the need for control, these things clouded your judgment. You thought that by killing them, you would protect yourself, but all you've done is condemn yourself. The figure's shoulders slumped, the facade of control slipping away. They took a deep breath, their eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and regret. I never wanted it to come to this. I never wanted anyone to die. But they left me no choice. They had seen too much, and they would have exposed me. Richard, with his charming facade, had no idea what he was getting into. He was too eager to exploit people for his own gain. Harriet, with her sharp mind, was a threat. Ida, she was the one who could see right through me. She knew the truth. Poirot's expression remained calm, his eyes reflecting a quiet understanding. And you, monsieur, were desperate to protect a secret, a crime that has haunted you for years, but in doing so, you destroyed the lives of those who could have helped you, who could have exposed your past and put an end to the pain you have been carrying. The figure's hands trembled, and they took a step back, as if trying to retreat from the truth that was now suffocating them. It wasn't supposed to be like this, they whispered. I thought I could control everything, make it all perfect. But it all fell apart. They died because of me. Poirot's voice softened, though it still held the quiet authority that had served him so well. The truth, monsieur, is that you were never in control. The past cannot be erased, and no amount of manipulation or murder can change that. You killed them to protect yourself, but in the end, it is the truth that will be your undoing. The killer's shoulders sagged, their eyes filled with despair. I didn't want anyone to know, they said, their voice barely audible. But now it's too late. You've uncovered everything. I can't hide anymore. Chapter 10. The Final Reveal. Poirot had spent days piecing together the scattered clues, the monogrammed cufflinks, the carefully arranged bodies, the cryptic messages, and most importantly, the killer's need for control. It had all led him to this moment where the final act of the mystery would unfold. The killer's identity had been a carefully guarded secret, hidden behind a web of lies and manipulation, but Poirot had seen through it. His sharp mind had cut through the layers of deception, and now the truth would be known. As they entered the room, Poirot's gaze immediately went to the figure standing by the window. The killer, a man or woman, seemed to be lost in thought, staring out into the night. Poirot could see the slight trembling of their hands, the barely perceptible tension in their posture. They had been cornered, their secrets exposed, but the final confrontation was inevitable. "Ah, mademoiselle," Poirot began, his voice soft yet firm. "Or should I say, monsieur, for I have discovered the truth. The web of lies you wove has been unraveled. It is time to face the consequences of your actions." The figure turned slowly, their eyes betraying a mixture of defiance and fear. The face before Poirot was not unfamiliar. Indeed, it was a face he had seen before, one that had been carefully hidden in the shadows of the investigation. Jenny Hobbs, the woman who had sought his help, the woman who had seemed so innocent and fearful, was, in fact, the key to the entire case. I didn't mean for any of this to happen," Jenny said, her voice trembling. She stepped forward, her eyes wide with guilt and fear. "I never wanted anyone to die. I never thought it would come to this." Poirot's expression softened, though his voice remained calm and measured. "You have played a pivotal role in this tragedy, mademoiselle. It is not your fault entirely, but you have been an unwilling accomplice to a larger plan. You did not realize it, but you were manipulated. The killer knew your fear, your guilt, and they used it against you." Jenny looked away, her eyes welling up with tears. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I was just trying to protect myself, to protect my past." Her voice faltered, and she wiped away a tear, her hands shaking. "But I didn't know who to trust. Richard made me feel safe. But in the end, I became a part of something terrible." Poirot nodded gently. "Richard Nagus, the man who pulled all the strings, had a dark past, mademoiselle, a past that you and the others were unknowingly linked to. His need for control, his obsession with perfection, led to these deaths, and you, mademoiselle, became part of his plan whether you wanted to or not." Jenny's face twisted with regret. "I didn't know about Richard's past. I didn't know what he was capable of until it was too late. I thought I was helping him, but I was just helping him destroy people's lives, and now they're all dead." Poirot took a step closer, his voice now steady and resolute. "But it is not just Richard who is responsible for these deaths, mademoiselle. No, it is you too. You unknowingly fed him the information he needed. You too were part of the manipulation. Your fear, your guilt, these were the emotions he preyed on. He made you believe that your own life was at risk, that you would be the next to die, and so you played your part without ever realizing the extent of your involvement." Jenny's face crumpled as the weight of Poirot's words settled in. "I should have told you everything from the start. I should have trusted you. But I was afraid. I didn't know what to do." Poirot gave her a sympathetic look. "I understand, mademoiselle. But you must now understand something else. The man who killed those 3 people was not just seeking revenge. No, monsieur, his motive was far deeper. The murders were not the result of a simple grudge. They were the result of a long-hidden secret, a secret that the victims knew, and one that could not be allowed to surface." Jenny shook her head, still struggling to comprehend the full extent of what Poirot was saying. "But what secret? What could they have known that was worth killing for?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with the clarity of understanding. "It was not just money, mademoiselle. Richard's obsession with perfection, with control, stemmed from something far darker, a crime long forgotten that the victims had unknowingly uncovered. The cufflinks, those monogrammed cufflinks, they were not a trivial detail, no, they were a symbol. They were the key to understanding the killer's identity." Jenny's expression was a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. "But the cufflinks, how do they fit into all of this?" Poirot's gaze hardened. "The initials on the cufflinks, P.I.J., were the link between Richard and the murderer. You see, the killer, monsieur or madame, used the cufflinks to mark their victims just as they had been marked. It was not a coincidence, mademoiselle. The killer's connection to Richard was far closer than you had imagined." The figure before Poirot stiffened, their face paling, as they finally understood what had been laid bare. You know now. You know everything." Poirot nodded. "I know everything. And now you will face the consequences of your actions." The room seemed to close in around the figure as Poirot's words hit home. The truth had been revealed. The killer, once so sure of their control, now stood at the mercy of the detective who had outwitted them at every turn. They had been hiding in plain sight, manipulating their way through the investigation, but Poirot had seen through their facade, revealing their true nature in the harsh light of truth. The killer's shoulders slumped and they collapsed into a chair, their hands covering their face in shame. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen," they whispered, their voice barely audible. "I never wanted anyone to die, but it was the only way. I had to keep the past buried. I had to protect us." Poirot watched them for a moment, his face still but his mind already moving to the next steps. "The past, monsieur or madame, is a dangerous thing to hide. It cannot be buried forever, no matter how hard you try. The truth always comes to light, as it has done here." Jenny sat in silence, her face pale with the weight of her own guilt. "But I never thought I could be a part of it," she whispered, barely meeting Poirot's eyes. I didn't know." Poirot gave a small, sad smile. "No one ever knows, mademoiselle, until it is too late. But now the truth is known, and justice will be done. You have played your part, but it is not too late to make things right." As the authorities arrived to take the killer into custody, Poirot stood in the quiet room, his gaze distant. The case was closed, but the emotional scars left behind would linger. The killer's need to protect a long-buried secret had led to death, destruction, and the loss of innocent lives. In the end, it was not just the crime that had driven the murders, but the psychological need to control the narrative, to keep the past hidden at all costs. For Poirot, the case was a reminder of the complexity of human emotions, how jealousy, guilt, love, and revenge could drive even the most calculated minds to commit unthinkable acts. The truth had won, but at a great cost. As he left the Monarch Hotel, his thoughts turned to the victims, their lives lost in the pursuit of a secret that could never remain hidden. The truth, in the end, had prevailed. And for Poirot, that was always enough.